I'm not your fiancée." The Duke smiled. "You are now." The contract was already signed. The morning post arrived at precisely 9:30, as it did every morning, carried into the breakfast room by Martha on a small silver tray that had seen better decades. Miss Rosalind Blackwell accepted the 3 letters without looking up from her tea, her attention fixed on the far more pressing matter of the household accounts spread before her. "Bills, bills, and more bills, I expect," her Aunt Philippa observed cheerfully from across the table, where she was engaged in the delicate operation of feeding toast crusts to her ancient spaniel, Mephistopheles. The dog had been named during a period of Gothic enthusiasm some 15 years past, and had since mellowed into a creature of profoundly undemonic temperament. "That's all that ever comes anymore. Bills and invitations to events we cannot afford to attend." "We can afford the subscription balls," Rosalind said absently, slitting open the first envelope with a butter knife. "And the Havisham Musicale requires nothing but our presence and our tolerance for Miss Havisham's attempts at Mozart." "Tolerance in abundance, then. I have reserves." Philippa fed another crust to Mephistopheles, who accepted it with the grave dignity of a creature who understood his own importance. "What news from the outside world, my dear? Has Napoleon escaped again? Has Prinny finally burst the seams of his corsets?" Rosalind scanned the first letter, a modiste's bill that was less alarming than anticipated, and set it aside for payment. The second was indeed an invitation. This one to a card party she had no intention of attending. The third bore an unfamiliar seal and was addressed in a solicitor's hand. "How peculiar," she murmured, examining it more closely. The seal was elaborate, speaking of London money and London pretension. The direction was formal: Miss Rosalind Blackwell, care of Mrs. Philippa Thorne, Queen's Square, Bath. "I don't recognize the firm." "Perhaps some distant relation has died and left you a fortune," Philippa suggested hopefully. "It does happen, you know. Not often, and not to anyone I've ever met, but the novels are quite clear on the subject." Rosalind smiled despite herself. "I believe I've catalogued all our relations, distant and otherwise. None of them possess fortunes worth leaving, and most of them possess grudges that would preclude leaving anything to us regardless." "Then open it and solve the mystery. The suspense is quite destroying my digestion." Rosalind broke the seal. The letter was brief, formal, and utterly incomprehensible. She read it once, then again, then a third time, with the growing certainty that she had somehow stepped into one of Aunt Philippa's beloved novels, the penny dreadful sort, where absurd coincidences drove implausible plots. "Rosalind?" Philippa's voice had sharpened. "You've gone quite pale. What is it?" "I don't—" Rosalind set the letter down, then picked it up again, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something sensible. "It's from a firm called Hartley & Sons, solicitors. They represent the Duke of Thornfield." "The Duke of Thornfield?" Philippa blinked. "Why would a duke's solicitors write to you? We don't know any dukes, do we? I feel certain I would remember knowing a duke." "We don't know any dukes." Rosalind's voice sounded strange to her own ears. "But apparently Papa did." The letter requested required her presence at a meeting the following morning at the firm's temporary Bath offices. The matter concerned, according to the formal phrasing that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate, a contractual obligation entered into by the late Mr. Edmund Blackwell and the late Duke of Thornfield, said obligation pertaining directly to Miss Rosalind Blackwell's person and future estate. "My person," Rosalind repeated blankly. "And future estate. What future estate? I have £300 a year and a collection of my father's books. That is the whole of my estate, present and future." Philippa had risen and circled the table to read over her shoulder. Her soft intake of breath suggested she found the letter no more comprehensible than Rosalind did. "Contractual obligation," she murmured. "What on earth could your father have—" She stopped abruptly. "Oh dear." "What?" Rosalind twisted to look at her aunt. "What do you know?" "Nothing, really. Nothing definite." But Philippa's round face had gone pink with distress, and she would not meet Rosalind's eyes. "Only, your father came to me shortly before he died. He was worried about you, about your future. He was dying. Of course he was worried. No, you don't understand. He was worried about money. He'd made some investments that had gone badly wrong. I never understood the details. Something about a shipping venture. He was afraid there wouldn't be enough to provide for you properly." Philippa twisted her hands together. "He asked me to sign some papers. He said it was merely a formality, something to do with consolidating his affairs. I didn't read them properly. I trusted him." The cold feeling that had begun in Rosalind's chest spread outward, crystallizing into something that felt unpleasantly like fear. "What papers, Aunt?" "I don't know. Truly, I don't know. They were all mixed together, and Edmund was so ill, and I was so worried about him." Philippa's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, my dear. I should have paid more attention, but it never occurred to me that it could be anything significant." Rosalind stared at the letter in her hands. Her father had been the most honest man she'd ever known, scrupulously ethical, almost painfully straightforward. He had taught her to read contracts carefully, to trust no one's word over written evidence, to protect herself from a world that was not always kind to women alone. What had he done? The offices of Hartley and Sons had established themselves in a respectable building on Milsom Street, the sort of address that whispered of money without shouting about it. Rosalind arrived at the appointed hour precisely, having spent a sleepless night cataloguing every possible explanation for the summons and rejecting each in turn as either implausible or impossible. She had dressed with care, her best day dress of deep blue wool, her mother's cameo at her throat, her hair pinned with more attention than she typically bothered with. If she was to face some unknown disaster, she would do so looking as composed and competent as possible. Armour came in many forms. The clerk who greeted her was elderly, impeccably dressed, and possessed of an expression that suggested he had seen every form of human drama and found most of it tedious. He escorted her to a private office with the air of a man performing a duty beneath his dignity. The office itself was handsomely appointed, but temporary, clearly spaces borrowed for this occasion rather than the firm's permanent home. Behind a massive desk sat a man of perhaps 50, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who rose at her entrance with the smooth courtesy of long practice. "Miss Blackwell, thank you for coming. I am Mr. Harold Hartley, senior partner of Hartley and Sons." He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. I imagine you have questions." "I have nothing but questions, Mr. Hartley." Rosalind sat, arranging her skirts with hands that did not tremble through sheer force of will. "Your letter was remarkably uninformative. A necessary precaution. The matter is delicate." He resumed his own seat and folded his hands on the desk before him. "I represent Sebastian Ashworth, the 7th Duke of Thornfield. His Grace's father, the late Duke, passed some 3 years ago. In the process of settling certain outstanding affairs of the estate, His Grace recently discovered a document that concerns you directly." "What manner of document?" Mr. Hartley reached into a drawer and withdrew a sheaf of papers, crisp and official, and bearing several imposing seals. "A betrothal contract, Miss Blackwell, signed 5 years ago by your father and the late Duke, witnessed and notarized according to all proper legal forms. It binds you in marriage to the current Duke of Thornfield." The words reached Rosalind's ears clearly enough. She understood each one individually, but together they formed a sentence that her mind simply refused to accept. "That's not possible." "I'm afraid it is not only possible, but legally binding." Mr. Hartley's voice held something that might have been sympathy, buried beneath layers of professional detachment. "The contract is quite thorough. Your father pledged your hand in marriage to the heir of the Thornfield dukedom. In exchange, the late Duke paid off substantial debts your father had accrued, debts that, had they come due, would have resulted in the loss of everything he possessed." "No," Rosalind shook her head. "My father would never. He believed in my right to choose my own future. He told me so many times. He would never sell me to pay his debts." "I cannot speak to your father's motivations, Miss Blackwell. I can only attest to the document before me, which bears his signature in his own hand and is witnessed by one Mrs. Philippa Thorne." Aunt Philippa. The papers she'd signed without reading. The papers she'd assumed were mere formalities. Rosalind felt the floor tilt beneath her, certainty crumbling like wet sand. "I knew nothing of this. I was never informed. Surely that invalidates—" "The contract does not require your knowledge or consent, only your father's authority as your guardian at the time of signing." Mr. Hartley's tone remained neutral, but she thought she caught a flicker of something in his eyes, pity perhaps, or merely the acknowledgement of an uncomfortable situation. "You were 20 years of age. Under law, your father's signature was binding. The current Duke, he knew about this? All this time?" "No. His Grace was as surprised as you are. The late Duke, for reasons unknown, never informed his son of the arrangement. The contract was discovered among his private papers only last month, and His Grace engaged our firm to verify its authenticity and determine the appropriate course of action." Rosalind drew a slow breath, forcing her thoughts into order. Panic would not help her. Anger would not help her. Only clear thinking would find a way out of this trap. "And what is the appropriate course of action, in His Grace's view?" Mr. Hartley hesitated, the first sign of uncertainty she had seen from him. "His Grace is travelling. He will arrive in Bath later today to discuss the matter with you personally. I am instructed only to inform you of the contract's existence and to provide you with a copy for your review." How generous of him! The sarcasm was perhaps unwise, but Rosalind could not quite contain it. She was to be informed of her impending servitude for what else could one call a forced marriage, and then wait meekly for her lord and master to appear and explain her fate. "I understand this is distressing, Miss Blackwell. If I may speak candidly." He waited for her nod before continuing. "His Grace is not, by reputation, an unreasonable man. Cold, perhaps, exacting in his standards, but not cruel. The contract binds both parties. He is no more free to ignore it than you are. I believe, though I am not authorized to say so formally, that he intends to discuss options rather than issue dictates." "Options," Rosalind laughed, though there was no humor in it. "What options can there possibly be? Either I marry a man I have never met, or what? What are the penalties for breach?" Mr. Hartley's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "Tell me." "The contract specifies that any breach by your party results in the immediate return of all funds provided by the late Duke with interest. Additionally, the co-signatory Mrs. Thorne would be held liable for a portion of damages." "How much?" "Approximately £12,000 in total." Rosalind closed her eyes. £12,000. She had 300 a year. Aunt Philippa had perhaps twice that, most of it tied up in the house, and an annuity that could not be touched. Together they could not raise £12,000 in a lifetime. Debtor's prison. For Philippa. For her gentle, foolish, loving aunt, who had signed papers without reading them because she trusted her brother. "I see," Rosalind said quietly. "I see exactly what my options are." She spent the hours before the Duke's expected arrival in a state of furious activity, unable to sit still. She walked the length of Queen Square until her feet ached. She read the contract 3 times, searching for loopholes and finding none. She calculated figures that refused to add up to anything hopeful. And she thought about her father. Edmund Blackwell had been a scholar and a gentleman, a man more comfortable with books than with business, who had somehow managed to support his family in modest comfort for most of Rosalind's childhood. She had known they were not wealthy. She had not known they were drowning. He must have been desperate, truly desperate, to do something so completely contrary to everything he had taught her. And he had done it to protect her, to ensure she would have a future, even if it was not the future she would have chosen. She could not decide whether to be furious with him or to weep. When the knock came at their door at 4 o'clock precisely, Rosalind was waiting in the small parlour, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged into an expression of perfect composure. Aunt Philippa, who had spent the day in tears and apologies, had been persuaded to remain upstairs. This was a battle Rosalind needed to fight alone. Martha announced the visitor with wide eyes and a voice that trembled slightly. His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield. He entered the room like a force of nature. Rosalind had prepared herself for various possibilities, an elderly lord seeking a young wife perhaps, or a dissolute rake looking for a respectable cover. She had not prepared herself for this. Sebastian Ashworth was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the kind of commanding presence that made their modest parlour seem suddenly inadequate. His dark hair was perhaps a shade too long for fashion, swept back from a face that would have been handsome if it had shown any warmth whatsoever. His grey eyes swept the room with the assessing gaze of a man accustomed to finding his surroundings beneath him. He wore his aristocracy like armour, every line of his perfectly tailored coat, every precise movement of his gloved hands, speaking of a world so far removed from Rosalind's own that she might as well have been looking at a creature from mythology. The Ice Duke. She had heard the nickname, now that she thought about it, whispered in ballrooms and assembly rooms. She had never paid attention. Dukes were not relevant to her life. Until now. Miss Blackwell. His voice was deep and cool, as lacking in warmth as his expression. Thank you for receiving me. Did I have a choice? The words were out before she could stop them. Perhaps not the wisest opening gambit, but Rosalind had never been particularly skilled at swallowing her thoughts. Something flickered in those grey eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or the surprise of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. You might have refused. It would have been foolish, but you might have done it. And so we come to the matter at hand. Rosalind did not rise from her seat. If he wished to stand looming over her like some sort of feudal overlord, that was his choice, but she would not scramble to accommodate him. The contract that binds me to marry you, whether I will or no. You have read it? 3 times. I found it remarkably thorough in its removal of my autonomy. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I did not write the contract, Miss Blackwell. I discovered it a month ago, as much a surprise to me as to you. I had no knowledge of my father's arrangement with yours. And yet here you are, prepared to enforce it. I am here to discuss it. He moved further into the room, his movements precise and controlled, and took the chair across from hers without waiting for an invitation. Up close, she could see fine lines at the corners of his eyes, not from smiling, she suspected, but from squinting at documents and frowning at disappointing underlings. I am not a monster, whatever you may have concluded. I have no interest in forcing a woman into marriage against her will. Then tear up the contract. I cannot or will not. Both. He held her gaze with an intensity that made her want to look away. She did not. The contract was signed by both our fathers. It involves debts paid and obligations incurred. To simply void it would require repayment of all funds. £12,000. Yes, Mr. Hartley was quite clear on that point. Rosalind kept her voice steady through sheer determination. Along with the imprisonment of my aunt, who signed as witness without understanding what she was signing. The Duke's expression did not change, but something shifted in the quality of his stillness. Your aunt would face debtor's prison. She has no means to pay her portion of the damages. Yes. A long silence stretched between them. Rosalind watched his face for any sign of feeling, and found none. He might have been carved from marble, this Duke of hers, cold and perfect and utterly without warmth. "I was not aware of that particular consequence," he said finally. "I apologize. It was not my intention to threaten an innocent woman." "And yet you appear prepared to threaten me." "I am not." He stopped, and for the first time a crack appeared in his composure. Frustration, perhaps, or something more complex. "Miss Blackwell, I am attempting to find a solution that does not destroy either of our lives. Your hostility, while understandable, is not helpful." "My hostility?" Rosalind felt a laugh building in her throat, sharp and unpleasant. "Your Grace, I awoke yesterday morning as a free woman. Today I discover I have been sold like livestock to pay my father's debts, sold to a man I have never met, who will have complete legal control over my person, my property, and my future. Forgive me if I am not feeling particularly helpful." The Duke's eyes flashed. "I am not the villain of this piece, Miss Blackwell. I did not create this situation any more than you did. I am, in fact, as trapped by it as you are. You are a duke. You could tear up the contract this moment and face no consequences beyond a bruised sense of honor. I, on the other hand, would lose everything, and worse, my aunt would lose everything. We are not equally trapped. You think I want this?" His voice rose, and for a moment she glimpsed something beneath the ice heat, anger, frustration that matched her own. "You think I wish to bind myself to a woman who looks at me as though I was something she found on the bottom of her shoe? I could have any heiress in England. I do not need your father's debts or your pointed observations about my character." "Then why are you here?" The question hung between them. The Duke stared at her, and Rosalind stared back, and neither of them breathed. "Because the contract exists," he said finally, and his voice had gone quiet again, the ice reforming over whatever fire had briefly emerged. "Because my father signed it, and whatever his reasons, I cannot simply pretend it did not happen. Because there are complications, business dealings that were predicated on the eventual marriage, social obligations that have been set in motion." He paused. "And because I find myself curious about the woman my father chose for me. He did not choose me. He purchased me." "Perhaps." The Duke's gaze travelled over her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "But he must have had reasons. My father was many things, but never foolish. He must have seen something in your family, your lineage, your—" He stopped. "My what? My extensive fortune? My powerful connections? My great beauty?" Rosalind spread her hands. "I am a gentleman's daughter of modest means, with no family to speak of beyond my aunt, and a face that has been described at best as pleasant. I cannot imagine what your father saw in me that was worth £12,000. The Duke's expression flickered. "Your father and mine knew each other at Oxford. I discovered that much in the papers. They were friends of a sort. Perhaps that explains it." "Perhaps." Rosalind did not believe it, not fully, but she filed the information away for later consideration. "It does not change the current situation." "No." The Duke rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the modest square with his hands clasped behind his back. "It does not." He was silent for a long moment. Rosalind watched the rigid line of his shoulders, the way he held himself apart even in stillness, and felt a curious flicker of something that was not quite sympathy. He was trapped too, in his own way. The contract bound them both, but his cage was gilded, and hers was not. "I have a proposal," he said finally, turning back to face her. "Not of marriage, not yet. A trial." "A trial?" "Come to Thornfield Park for 6 weeks, as my guest and as my publicly acknowledged betrothed." He held up a hand to forestall her objection. "We are both strangers to each other. We have formed judgments based on circumstance rather than character. I propose that we spend 6 weeks becoming acquainted. If, at the end of that time, either of us finds the match truly unbearable, if we cannot envision building any sort of life together, I will void the contract." Rosalind's heart lurched. "You would cover the penalties? All of them?" "All of them. Your aunt would face no consequences. You would be free to return to your life here, with my apologies for the inconvenience." It was more than she had dared hope for. And yet, what if you decide the match is unbearable? What guarantee do I have that you will not simply enforce the contract anyway? My word. The word of a stranger. His jaw tightened. The word of a duke and of a gentleman. Forgive me, Your Grace, but I have recently learned that even the best of men can make choices that betray their principles. My father was the most honest man I ever knew, and yet he signed my life away without my knowledge or consent. Rosalind rose from her chair, meeting his eyes directly. "I will need more than your word." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, as she had expected, but something that looked almost like respect. "What would you require?" "A written agreement, witnessed and notarized, stating the terms of this trial and the consequences of its various outcomes, including your explicit promise to void the original contract if either party finds the match unsuitable." The Duke studied her for a long moment. "You negotiate like a solicitor, Miss Blackwell. I had an excellent teacher. My father may have made one catastrophic error in judgment, but he also ensured I would never sign a document I did not fully understand." She smiled without warmth. "I find it a useful skill." "Very well." The Duke inclined his head. "I will have the papers drawn up. Is there anything else?" "Several things. First, my aunt will accompany me to Thornfield Park. I will not spend 6 weeks unchaperoned in a stranger's home, regardless of our supposed engagement." "Agreed." "Second, I will have my own chambers with a lock on the door, and I will not be expected to perform any wifely duties before an actual wedding has taken place." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or that same reluctant respect. "I assure you, Miss Blackwell, I have no intention of forcing myself on an unwilling woman. You will have your own chambers, your own privacy, and my word that I will not enter without invitation." "Third," Rosalind hesitated. This was the most important point, and the most difficult to articulate. "Third, you will treat this as a genuine attempt at understanding, not a formality to be endured. If we are to discover whether we can build a life together, we must actually speak to each other. Not as duke and dependent, but as—" She stumbled, unsure of the word she wanted. "As equals?" His voice was dry. "As potential partners." She met his gaze steadily. "I have no interest in being a decorative addition to your household, Your Grace. If I marry, I will be a wife with opinions and intelligence, and the expectation that those things will be valued rather than tolerated. If that is not the kind of marriage you want, then we may end this trial now and save ourselves 6 weeks of mutual disappointment." The Duke was silent for so long that Rosalind began to wonder if she had overstepped. Then, slowly, something changed in his face. The ice did not melt precisely, but it seemed to thin, revealing glimpses of the complex landscape beneath. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "I imagine not. What did you expect? A fortune hunter, or a schemer? Someone who had manipulated my father into this arrangement for her own benefit. He shook his head slightly. Instead, I find a woman who would rather face poverty than surrender her principles. It is not what I am accustomed to. Perhaps you have been keeping poor company, Your Grace. Perhaps I have. He held out his hand, not to shake, but palm up, an offering rather than a demand. 6 weeks, Miss Blackwell. I give you my word that I will approach them with an open mind, if you will do the same. And at the end, regardless of the outcome, you will have choices. That much I can promise. Rosalind looked at his hand. It was a strong hand, well-shaped, with long fingers and a dusting of dark hair across the back. A hand that could sign documents that determined the course of her life. A hand that was offering, against all expectation, something that looked almost like fairness. She took it. His grip was warm and firm, and something sparked between them at the contact, not attraction precisely, but awareness. Recognition of a worthy opponent, perhaps, or something more complicated that she did not want to examine too closely. 6 weeks, she agreed, and then we shall see. The carriage arrived 3 days later, an elegant equipage in dark green with the Thornfield crest on the door, drawn by matched bays that probably cost more than Rosalind's entire annual income. Aunt Philippa had spent those 3 days in a flurry of packing and preparation, alternating between tearful apologies and nervous excitement at the prospect of visiting a duke's estate. "It will be an adventure," she kept saying. "We must think of it as an adventure, my dear." Rosalind thought of it as an ordeal to be endured, but she packed her best dresses, such as they were, and her books, and her mother's jewellery, and tried not to think too hard about what the next 6 weeks might bring. The Duke himself did not appear for their departure. He had sent word that he would meet them at Thornfield Park, having business in London that required his attention. Rosalind was relieved. The carriage journey would take 2 days. Spending them in forced proximity to her reluctant betrothed held limited appeal. Instead, she had time to think, to watch the countryside roll past the gentle hills of Somerset, giving way to the wilder landscapes of Wiltshire, and to consider the impossible situation in which she found herself. She was going to marry a duke, or she was going to spend 6 weeks pretending she might, and then return to her quiet life in Bath, her independence preserved, but her heart no. She would not think about hearts. Hearts were not relevant to this negotiation. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. She would approach it with the clear-eyed practicality her father had taught her, and she would not allow herself to be swayed by grey eyes or broad shoulders, or the unexpected flicker of respect she had glimpsed in a cold, aristocratic face. Thornfield Park, when they finally arrived, was everything Rosalind had expected, and yet somehow more. The house rose from the landscape like something out of a dream, ancient stone softened by centuries of ivy, windows that caught the afternoon light and turned it to gold, gardens that seemed to flow naturally from the parkland surrounding them. "Oh my," Aunt Philippa breathed. "Oh, Rosalind, it's beautiful." It was beautiful. It was also enormous and overwhelming, and a reminder that she was stepping into a world where she did not belong and might never belong, regardless of what contracts said. The servants who greeted them were impeccably trained, welcoming without being obsequious. An elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, she introduced herself, showed them to their rooms with warmth that seemed genuine rather than performed. "His Grace will return this evening," she told Rosalind as they climbed the wide staircase. "He asked that you might join him for dinner, if you are not too tired from your journey." Of course. What else could she say? Her chambers were lovely, a sitting room and bedroom overlooking the gardens, decorated in shades of blue and cream that seemed designed to soothe rather than impress. There was indeed a lock on the door. Rosalind tested it twice, then felt foolish for her suspicion. He had given his word. And whatever else she might think of the Duke of Thornfield, she was beginning to believe he was a man who kept his word. Dinner was a formal affair, held in a dining room that could have seated 30 and instead held only 2. The Duke sat at the head of the table. Rosalind had been placed at his right hand, close enough for conversation, but far enough for propriety. Between them stretched an expanse of polished mahogany, crystal, and silver that seemed designed to emphasize the gulf between their worlds. "I trust your journey was comfortable," the Duke said, as a footman served the first course. "Quite comfortable, thank you." Rosalind took a sip of wine, excellent wine, of course. "Your carriage is very well appointed. I am glad you approve." Silence fell. Rosalind contemplated the soup before her and wondered if this was what the next 6 weeks would be like. Stilted pleasantries exchanged across vast distances, neither of them willing to be the first to breach the walls of formality. Well, if he would not, then she would. They had agreed to genuine conversation, after all. "Tell me about the estate," she said abruptly. "How long has it been in your family?" The Duke looked up, surprise flickering briefly across his face. "Since the time of William the Conqueror. The first Ashworth was granted these lands for service at Hastings. We have held them ever since." 800 years. Rosalind shook her head. "I cannot imagine it. My family's history stretches back perhaps 3 generations before it becomes murky. Merchants and clergymen mostly, respectable but hardly distinguished. There is nothing shameful in respectable origins, Miss Blackwell. I did not say there was, but you must admit the contrast is significant." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "My ancestors fought and schemed and occasionally murdered their way to this estate. They made strategic marriages, forged convenient alliances, and did whatever was necessary to preserve their power. There is blood on these lands, Miss Blackwell, not all of it honourable. A merchant's honest trade may have much to recommend it by comparison." It was more than she had expected from him, more introspection, more willingness to see beyond the gilded surface of his heritage. She filed it away with the other small surprises he had offered her. "You speak as though you are not proud of your family. I am proud of some things: the estate, the tenants, the work we have done in recent generations to repair some of the damage our ancestors caused." He set down his wineglass. "But I am not blind to the cost of privilege, Miss Blackwell. Everything I have was built on the labor and sacrifice of others. Recognizing that is not shame, it is merely honesty." Rosalind studied him across the candle-lit table. In this light, with his guard partially lowered, he looked less like a marble statue, and more like a man tired, perhaps, and carrying burdens she could not see. "You are not what I expected either," she admitted. "What did you expect?" "Arrogance, entitlement. A man who saw a contract as merely his due." She smiled slightly. "Instead, I find someone who speaks of honest trade and ancestral blood with equal weight. It is disconcerting. Perhaps we have both been making unfair assumptions. Perhaps." Rosalind returned her attention to her meal. "But 6 weeks is a long time, Your Grace. There will be ample opportunity for us to discover each other's true flaws. I have no doubt you will catalogue mine thoroughly. I am nothing if not thorough." Was that almost a smile on his face? It was gone before she could be certain, but something in the air between them had shifted, some of the tension easing, replaced by something that felt almost like possibility. It was only the first evening. There would be many more to come, and many more opportunities for disappointment or discovery. But as Rosalind retired to her chambers that night, she found herself thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, this trial might prove more interesting than she had anticipated. The Duke of Thornfield was not what he appeared to be, and she was increasingly curious to discover what lay beneath the ice. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the distant sound of birdsong. For a moment she forgot where she was, forgot the contract, the Duke, the impossible situation in which she found herself. Then memory returned, and with it a complicated knot of emotions she could not quite untangle. She dressed without calling for a maid, a habit of independence she had no intention of abandoning. Her dress was simple, a morning gown of soft green muslin that she had made herself, lacking the elaborate trim and expensive fabric of fashionable ladies, but clean and well-fitted. She was who she was. If the Duke could not accept that, better to know now. Breakfast was laid out in a sunny parlour, but the Duke was not present. A footman informed her that His Grace had gone out early to visit the tenants and would return by midday. "Would you care for anything else, miss?" the footman asked. "No, thank you. Actually, yes. Could you show me to the library?" The library was everything she had hoped for, and more, 2 stories of books, leather-bound and gilt-edged, climbing toward a ceiling painted with clouds and classical figures. Rosalind stood in the doorway and felt something in her chest ease for the first time in days. Here, at least, she could breathe. She was deep in a volume of Greek poetry when the door opened, and a voice she did not recognize said cheerfully, "Oh, good, you're not decorative. Sebastian was worried you might be decorative." Rosalind looked up to find a young man standing in the doorway, perhaps 25, fair where the Duke was dark, with an open, friendly face that bore only a faint resemblance to his brother's austere features. "Lord Marcus Ashworth," he said, sweeping a bow that managed to be both elegant and slightly mocking. "Sebastian's younger and more charming brother. You must be the mysterious betrothed we've all been hearing about." "Miss Blackwell." Rosalind rose and curtsied. "And I'm afraid I cannot speak to your brother's concerns about decoration, as he has not shared them with me." "No, he wouldn't. Sebastian never shares anything if he can avoid it." Marcus crossed to a chair and threw himself into it with the careless grace of a man utterly comfortable in his surroundings. "But I could tell he was worried. He expected you to be, well, eager, calculating, the sort of woman who would see a duke's coronet and lose all sense of proportion. And instead? Instead, you're reading Homer in the original Greek at 9 o'clock in the morning." Marcus grinned. "I like you already." Despite herself, Rosalind smiled. "You are very different from your brother." "Everyone is different from my brother. Sebastian was born middle-aged and has only grown more serious since." But there was affection beneath the mockery. "Don't let him frighten you, Miss Blackwell. He's not as cold as he pretends to be. I am not frightened of His Grace." "No?" Marcus tilted his head, studying her with more perception than his casual manner suggested. "Most people are, even people who have no reason to be. There's something about him that makes people want to either flee or bow. Perhaps I am not most people. Perhaps you're not." Marcus rose from his chair in a single fluid motion. "I came to invite you for a walk around the grounds, if you're willing. Sebastian asked me to show you the estate while he's occupied with business. He seemed to think you might find it interesting." The Duke had thought about what might interest her. It was a small thing, but it caught Rosalind's attention, a consideration she had not expected from a man so clearly accustomed to having his own preferences take precedence. "I would like that very much," she said, and set aside her Homer. The grounds were as beautiful as the house gardens giving way to parkland, parkland giving way to woods and fields, and the distant glitter of a lake. Marcus proved to be an entertaining guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of boyhood adventures with an easy charm that made the hours pass quickly. But beneath the charm, Rosalind detected something more serious. When he spoke of his brother, of their childhood, of the ways Sebastian had changed after their mother's death, of the first broken engagement that had frozen something vital in him, his voice softened with genuine concern. "He deserves to be happy," Marcus said at last, as they paused at the edge of the lake. "He doesn't believe it, but he does. 7 years ago, he thought he'd found it Lady Catherine Hale, the most beautiful woman in England. He loved her desperately, and she—" He stopped. "It ended badly. She ran off with our cousin Frederick a week before the wedding. Sebastian discovered them in a very compromising position. Rosalind winced. How horrible. It nearly destroyed him. Not because of wounded pride, though there was that too, but because he'd genuinely trusted her. He'd let down his guard, let himself believe that someone could love him for himself and not just for his title. And she... Marcus shook his head. She'd been carrying on with Frederick the whole time. The entire engagement was a performance designed to secure the dukedom while she pursued her real passion elsewhere. It explained so much. The ice, the distance, the assumption that Rosalind must be another schemer come to exploit him. He had trusted once, loved once, and been burned so badly that he'd built walls of frost around himself to prevent it from ever happening again. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. "Because if you're going to have any chance of getting through to him, you need to understand what you're fighting against." Marcus turned to face her, his expression serious. "He won't make it easy, Miss Blackwell. He'll push you away, test you, look for evidence that you're just like her. But if you can be patient, if you can show him that you're different—" "I may not want to get through to him," Rosalind interrupted. "This is a trial, Lord Marcus, a negotiation, not a romance." "Is it?" Marcus smiled, but there was something knowing in his eyes. "Perhaps. But I saw the way he looked when he came back from Bath. Something had shifted. For the first time in years he seemed interested in something other than duty and obligation." Rosalind opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. She thought of the Duke's hand extended toward her, offering something that looked almost like fairness. She thought of his voice softening when he spoke of honest trade and ancestral blood. She thought of the way his eyes had flickered when she challenged him, showing heat beneath the ice. She thought of how she had lain awake last night, wondering about the landscape beneath his frozen surface. "We should return to the house," she said finally. "His Grace will be back soon." Marcus nodded, tactful enough not to push further. But as they walked back through the gardens, Rosalind found herself turning his words over in her mind, examining them from every angle. He won't make it easy. No, she had not expected him to. But perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to understand why a difficult battle might be worth fighting. The Duke was waiting for them when they returned, standing on the terrace with his hands clasped behind his back. He was watching the approach of his brother and his betrothed with an expression Rosalind could not quite read, something between wariness and anticipation, as though he was bracing for impact while simultaneously hoping for something else entirely. "Miss Blackwell, Marcus," he inclined his head. "I trust the tour was informative." "Your brother is an excellent guide," Rosalind said, "and your estate is beautiful. I can see why generations of your family have fought to preserve it." Something flickered in his grey eyes. "Indeed, it is everything to me." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Rosalind thought of what Marcus had told her of a mother lost, a love betrayed, a man who had learned to pour all his capacity for feeling into land and duty because people had proven too dangerous to trust. "I hope you will show me more of it yourself," she said quietly. "I would like to understand it as you do." The Duke's expression shifted surprise, and beneath it, something that looked almost like hope. "I would like that," he said. "Very much." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. But it was something. A crack in the ice. A beginning. Rosalind looked at the man who held her future in his hands, and she felt, for the first time, something other than fear or resentment. Curiosity. Interest. The faint, dangerous stirring of possibility. 6 weeks, she reminded herself. Only 6 weeks. But as she followed the Duke into the house, she found herself wondering if 6 weeks might be long enough to change everything, or whether the walls around Sebastian Ashworth's heart were built too high and too thick for any woman to breach. She would discover the truth soon enough. And whatever she found, she would face it with her eyes open and her heart guarded. She would not make the same mistake he had made. She would not trust too quickly, or love too easily, or let herself be destroyed by hope that proved false. But neither would she run from the challenge. The game was only beginning. The first week at Thornfield Park passed in a rhythm that Rosalind had not anticipated. Neither the cold formality she had feared, nor the forced intimacy she had dreaded, but something in between. Something that felt, against all expectation, almost natural. Mornings she spent in the library, working through the Duke's remarkable collection with the systematic thoroughness her father had taught her. The shelves held treasures she had only read about first editions, rare manuscripts, volumes in Greek and Latin and French that made her fingers tremble as she turned their pages. If nothing else came of this strange arrangement, she would have had access to books she could never have afforded to own. Afternoons brought riding lessons, at the Duke's suggestion. Rosalind had learned to ride as a girl, but had not sat a horse in years, lacking both the means and the opportunity. Sebastian, she had begun to think of him as Sebastian, though she still called him Your Grace aloud, had provided a gentle mare named Meadowsweet, and patient instruction that surprised her with its kindness. "You're too tense in your shoulders," he said during their third lesson, riding beside her on a path that wound through the parkland. "The horse can feel your anxiety. You must trust her to know her footing." No censure in his voice. If anything, she heard understanding, the recognition of a fellow soul who had learned that trust was a currency too easily spent and too painfully lost. Evenings were the most surprising. Dinner, of course, remained formal courses served on porcelain, conversation navigating careful paths around anything too personal. But afterward, in the drawing room, something loosened. Sebastian would read while Rosalind played the pianoforte badly, she admitted freely, but he seemed not to mind. Sometimes Marcus joined them, filling the silences with cheerful chatter that neither she nor Sebastian seemed capable of producing. Sometimes Aunt Philippa would venture down from her chambers, where she had been happily ensconced with a mountain of novels and the dedicated attention of Mrs. Pemberton, who seemed determined to spoil her thoroughly. It was almost comfortable, almost domestic, almost like the life she might have had if circumstances had been different. She reminded herself regularly that it was temporary, that the contract still hung over them like a sword, that Sebastian's willingness to be civil did not mean he had any genuine feeling for her beyond obligation. But it was becoming harder to remember, with each passing day, exactly why she should guard her heart so carefully. The second week brought rain days of it, grey and relentless, trapping them indoors and forcing proximity that fine weather had allowed them to avoid. Rosalind found herself spending more time in Sebastian's company than she had expected, their paths crossing in hallways and doorways and the cosy corners of the library where they both sought refuge from the gloom. On the fourth day of rain, she discovered him in the music room, standing before a window with his back to the door, watching water stream down the glass with an expression she could not read. "Your Grace?" He turned, and for a moment his face was unguarded, weary and sad, and somehow younger than she had ever seen him. Then the mask slipped back into place, smooth and impenetrable. "Miss Blackwell, forgive me. I did not hear you enter. The rain covers many sounds." She moved further into the room, drawn by something she could not name. "Are you well?" "Perfectly well." It was clearly a lie, but she did not press. They were not, despite the intimacy of their situation, truly intimate. She had no right to demand his secrets. "I came to practice," she said instead, gesturing toward the pianoforte. "But I can return later if you wish to be alone." "No." The word came quickly, almost urgently. He seemed to catch himself, and when he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "No, please. I would welcome the company." Rosalind settled at the instrument and began to play a simple piece, something by Handel that required more feeling than technique. Behind her, she heard Sebastian move to a chair, heard the creak of leather as he sat. The music filled the room, soft and melancholy, matching the rain against the windows. She let herself sink into it, let the notes carry the complicated tangle of emotions she had been struggling to suppress. The loneliness of her situation, the unexpected sweetness of moments shared with a man who should have been her enemy, the fear that she was beginning to feel things she could not afford to feel. When the piece ended, the silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before, heavier, more charged. "That was beautiful," Sebastian said quietly. "You told me you played badly." "I do play badly. I merely feel the music well enough to hide my lack of skill." She turned on the bench to face him. "My mother used to say that passion could compensate for many technical failures." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Rosalind smiled, though the expression carried grief. "She died when I was 17, a fever that took her in 3 days. My father never recovered. I think he died of heartbreak as much as illness." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he said, "My mother died when I was 12, also a fever. My father did not grieve, at least not in any way I could see. He simply became harder, colder, more focused on duty and legacy." It was more than he had ever offered her about his past, more than she had expected him to share. Rosalind felt something shift in her chest, a softening, a reaching out toward the lonely boy he must have been. "I'm sorry," she said. "That must have been terribly lonely." It was. He met her eyes, and for once he did not look away. "I had Marcus at least. He was only 8, and he needed someone to comfort him. Taking care of him gave me purpose when I might otherwise have drowned in grief. You were 12 years old. You should not have had to be strong for anyone." "Perhaps not. But I was the heir, the future duke. Strength was expected of me." His voice was matter-of-fact, but she heard the old pain beneath it. "My father made certain I understood that. Ashworths do not weep. Ashworths do not show weakness. Ashworths endure." "That sounds exhausting." Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been amusement. "It is profoundly exhausting, but one becomes accustomed to it." "Or one freezes solid," Rosalind said quietly, "and forgets what warmth feels like." Sebastian stared at her. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, enclosing them in a world of grey light and half-spoken truths. "Is that what you think has happened to me?" "I think—" She hesitated, choosing her words with care. "I think you built walls to survive an impossible situation. I think those walls served you well for many years. And I think you may have forgotten that walls which keep pain out also keep warmth in." He was silent for so long that she thought she had overstepped. Then, slowly, he rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat at the pianoforte. He did not touch her, maintained the careful distance that propriety demanded, but he stood close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, could watch the struggle playing out behind his grey eyes. "You see too much, Miss Blackwell. I see what you show me, which is more, I suspect, than you show most people." "Yes." The word was barely a whisper. "Far more." They stood like that for a long moment, balanced on the edge of something neither of them could name. Then Sebastian stepped back, and the spell broke, and he was once again the Duke of Thornfield, composed, controlled, armoured in ice. "The rain appears to be lessening," he said, his voice smooth and distant. Perhaps we might walk in the gardens tomorrow, if the weather permits. I would like that, Your Grace. He nodded and left the room without another word. Rosalind remained at the pianoforte, her hands resting on keys she no longer had the heart to play, and wondered what exactly had just passed between them. Something had shifted. Something had opened. But whether it would lead to connection or catastrophe, she could not begin to guess. The rain cleared overnight, leaving a world washed clean and glittering under a pale spring sun. True to his word, Sebastian appeared after breakfast to escort Rosalind through the gardens, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt the full weight of awkwardness between them. He had shown her too much yesterday. She had seen too clearly. The careful equilibrium they had established was disturbed, and neither of them seemed to know how to restore it. "The roses will bloom in another month," Sebastian said, gesturing toward a bed of bushes that showed only the faintest hints of green. "My mother planted this garden. It was her particular pride. It's beautiful even now." Rosalind paused to examine a climbing rose that had begun to bud despite the season's chill. She must have had a gift for it. She had a gift for many things, for making things grow, for making people feel seen. He stopped himself, shaking his head slightly. "Forgive me. I do not usually speak of her so freely." "You needn't apologize. I asked about the garden. It's natural that you would think of her." They walked in silence for a while, following paths that wound between flower beds and hedges and ornamental trees just beginning to show their spring colors. The air smelled of wet earth and growing things, and somewhere nearby a bird was singing with determined optimism. "May I ask you something?" Sebastian said finally. "Of course." "When you learned about the contract, when you realized what your father had done, were you angry with him?" Rosalind considered the question carefully. "Yes, furiously angry, for about 3 hours." She smiled slightly. "Then I began to think about why he might have done it. The debts, the fear of leaving me unprotected, the desperation of a dying man watching his world crumble around him." "And that diminished your anger?" "No, but it complicated it." She bent to touch a spray of early flowers, feeling their cool petals against her fingertips. "I think love and anger can exist together. I think we can be furious with someone and still understand why they did what they did, still forgive them eventually, even if forgiveness takes time." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. "I have not been able to forgive my father, for many things, but particularly for this, for binding me to a stranger without my knowledge or consent, just as yours bound you. Perhaps forgiveness will come in time. Perhaps." But he did not sound convinced. They had reached a small pond at the far end of the garden, its surface still and mirror-bright in the morning light. A stone bench sat beside it, worn smooth by generations of use, and Sebastian gestured for Rosalind to sit. "I should tell you something," he said, remaining standing, his back to her as he gazed out over the water. "Something Marcus may already have mentioned, but which you deserve to hear from me directly." "The first engagement?" Rosalind kept her voice gentle. "Lady Catherine Hale." Sebastian's shoulders tensed, but he did not turn around. "Marcus talks too much." "He loves you. He wants me to understand." "Understand what? That I was fool enough to fall in love with a woman who saw me as nothing but a title? That I trusted her with everything and she repaid that trust with betrayal?" His voice had gone harsh, edged with old pain. "What is there to understand except my own stupidity? You were not stupid. You were trusting. There is a difference." He turned then, and his face was raw in a way she had never seen the ice stripped away, leaving only the wounds beneath. "She made me believe she loved me. She made me believe I was worthy of love, not despite my position, but because of who I was. And all the while she was carrying on with my own cousin, laughing at my naivety, planning to secure the dukedom while pursuing her real passion elsewhere. Sebastian. I found them together, a week before the wedding. His voice cracked. In her family's conservatory, tangled in each other's arms like something out of a French novel. She saw me watching and she smiled, as though it were all a tremendous joke that I had been too stupid to understand. Rosalind rose from the bench and crossed to him, driven by an impulse she did not pause to examine. She took his hands in hers the first time she had touched him deliberately since that handshake in her aunt's parlour, and held them firmly, refusing to let him retreat. "Look at me," she said. He did, his grey eyes bright with something that might have been unshed tears. What she did was monstrous. Not because she did not love you, we cannot control what we feel, but because she used your love as a weapon against you, because she took your trust and twisted it into a knife. That was not your failure. That was hers. I should have seen. How? By being suspicious of everyone? By assuming every woman who showed you kindness had ulterior motives? Rosalind shook her head. That is not wisdom, Sebastian. That is merely a different kind of prison. His hands tightened on hers. You say my name. She had not realized until he pointed it out. I apologize. Your Grace. No. His voice was low, urgent. Say it again. Sebastian. Something broke in his expression. Something that had been held rigid for far too long finally gave way. He did not weep. The habits of a lifetime were too deeply ingrained for that. But she saw the struggle, saw how close he came to shattering entirely. I thought I would never be able to trust anyone again, he said quietly. I thought that part of me was dead, frozen beyond recovery. And now? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching her face as though looking for something he desperately needed to find. Now I am not so certain. Things changed after that morning by the pond. Not dramatically, they were both too cautious for dramatic shifts, but in small ways that accumulated like snowflakes, building into something neither of them had expected. Sebastian began seeking her out during the day, appearing in the library with questions about books she was reading, joining her on afternoon walks without waiting for formal invitations. Their conversations deepened, moving beyond safe topics to touch on philosophy, politics, faith, doubt. They disagreed often. Sebastian was more conservative than Rosalind in most matters, shaped by duty and tradition, but their disagreements were stimulating rather than hostile, each challenging the other to think more clearly. Rosalind found herself laughing more than she had in years. Sebastian, she discovered, possessed a dry wit that emerged only rarely, but was devastating when it did. He could summarize a pompous dinner guest in 3 cutting words, could find absurdity in the most formal situations, could make her snort tea through her nose with an observation so unexpected she could not contain her reaction. "You're terrible," she told him, after one particularly undignified episode involving his imitation of a local vicar's preaching style. "Absolutely terrible. That poor man put 3 duchesses to sleep during his Easter sermon. I am merely providing educational commentary. Educational commentary that made me choke on my refreshments. Consider it a lesson in the dangers of taking tea while I am speaking." She had thrown a cushion at him. He had caught it with an expression of such affronted dignity that she had started laughing all over again. It was dangerous, this easiness between them. Rosalind knew it, felt the warning bells ringing in some corner of her heart that had not yet forgotten to be cautious. But the warnings grew fainter each day, drowned out by the simple pleasure of being known, truly known by another person. Marcus noticed, of course. He noticed everything. "My brother smiled at breakfast this morning," he announced, dropping into the chair across from Rosalind in the library. "Actually smiled, with teeth, I nearly fell off my chair in shock. Perhaps he was pleased with his eggs. His eggs, Marcus snorted. Sebastian has never been pleased with eggs in his entire life. He was pleased because you told a joke about the newspaper editorial, and for approximately 3 seconds he forgot to be the Ice Duke and remembered he was a human being. Lord Marcus. Don't Lord Marcus me. I've been trying to thaw him out for 7 years. You've managed it in 3 weeks. He leaned forward, his expression serious beneath the playful manner. I don't know what you're doing, Miss Blackwell, but please don't stop. I'm not doing anything special. We merely talk. That's precisely what's special. No one talks to Sebastian. People deliver reports to him, or petition him, or flatter him, or complain at him. No one talks to him, as though he were simply a man rather than a title. Rosalind considered this. It never occurred to me to treat him otherwise. He is simply a man, a rather stubborn one, with more walls than a medieval fortress, but still just a man. And that, Marcus said, is exactly why you might be the best thing that ever happened to him. The 3rd week brought visitors. Rosalind was in the garden when the carriage arrived, a sleek black equipage with a crest she did not recognize. She watched from a distance as footmen scrambled to assist its occupants. A woman of striking beauty, dark-haired and elegant, accompanied by a man whose face she could not quite see from this angle. Something cold settled in her stomach. Instinct, perhaps, or the observation of how the household staff moved with unusual tension, their efficient bustle carrying an undertone of anxiety. She made her way back to the house slowly, giving the visitors time to be received before she had to face them. But Sebastian met her in the hallway, his face set in lines of barely controlled fury. I must warn you, he said quietly, taking her arm and drawing her into the small parlour. We have guests, uninvited guests. The carriage in the drive? Lady Constance Beckford, a neighbour, and with her... He stopped, and she saw the muscle jump in his jaw. Frederick Ashworth, my cousin. The cousin. The man who had stolen Sebastian's first betrothed. The man who had been tangled in Lady Catherine's arms when Sebastian found them together. Why would he come here? Because he is incapable of shame, apparently. And because Lady Constance... Sebastian's hands clenched at his sides. Lady Constance has made her interest in the dukedom quite clear. She has been pursuing me for years. When she heard about the betrothal contract, she must have decided to investigate her competition. I see. Rosalind straightened her spine. Then I suppose I should meet her. You don't have to. I am your betrothed, Your Grace, officially, publicly, and for the next 3 weeks at least. If this Lady Constance wishes to investigate me, I would prefer she do so to my face, rather than through gossip and speculation. Sebastian studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, not the rare, genuine smile she had come to treasure, but something sharper, something almost predatory. You are magnificent, he said. Has anyone ever told you that? Not once in my entire life. Then they were fools. He offered his arm. Shall we? Lady Constance Beckford was everything Rosalind had expected and worse. Beautiful in the polished, calculating way of women who had learned to use beauty as a weapon. Dressed in the latest fashion, every detail of her appearance designed to intimidate. Her smile when Sebastian introduced Rosalind was flawless and utterly insincere. Miss Blackwell, how delightful to finally meet the mysterious fiancée. Her eyes swept over Rosalind's simple morning dress with barely concealed disdain. Sebastian has been remarkably secretive about you. One might almost think he was hiding something. One might think many things, Rosalind replied pleasantly. But I find it's best to form judgments based on evidence rather than imagination. Lady Constance's smile flickered. Indeed, how pragmatic. Frederick Ashworth was easier to read, a handsome man running to softness, with the kind of easy charm that suggested he had never been denied anything he wanted. He watched Rosalind with open curiosity, and Sebastian with something that looked almost like triumph. "Cousin," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of mockery. "It's been too long. I was delighted when Constance suggested we call. Family should stay connected, don't you think?" "Family." Sebastian's voice could have frozen fire. "Yes. I have always been deeply moved by your concern for family connections." The barb landed, but Frederick merely smiled. "Ah, still holding grudges, I see. I had hoped 7 years might have mellowed you. Certain things do not mellow with time." Rosalind watched this exchange with the acute attention of someone who understood that undercurrents mattered more than words. Frederick was not here by accident. His presence was calculated an attempt to unsettle Sebastian, to remind him of old wounds, to demonstrate that the past could never be fully escaped. And Lady Constance was watching Rosalind with the assessing gaze of a predator sizing up its prey. "I must confess," Lady Constance said, settling herself on the settee with deliberate grace, "I was surprised to learn of the engagement. Sebastian has been so determined to remain unmarried. One assumed he had given up on the institution entirely." "People can change," Rosalind said, "given sufficient motivation." "And what motivated this particular change, I wonder? The contract, presumably." Lady Constance's smile sharpened. "One hears such interesting rumours about the circumstances of your engagement." "One hears many things, not all of them accurate." "No, but some of them are." Lady Constance accepted a cup of tea from the footman and took a delicate sip. "Your father was in considerable debt, I understand, and the old Duke paid those debts in exchange for, well, in exchange for you." The silence that followed was absolute. Rosalind felt Sebastian go rigid beside her, felt the fury radiating from him like heat from a fire. "You seem remarkably well informed about private family matters," Rosalind said, keeping her voice level through sheer will. "I wonder where you obtained such detailed information." "Oh, these things get around." Lady Constance waved a dismissive hand. "Servants talk. Solicitors are not always discreet. And frankly, my dear, a contract of this nature is hardly the sort of thing that stays secret for long." "Constance," Sebastian's voice was ice and iron, "I would advise you to choose your next words very carefully." "I meant no offence, of course. I merely think Miss Blackwell should understand what she's walking into." Lady Constance turned her sharp gaze on Rosalind. "Society can be unforgiving, you know. A woman who obtained her position through commercial means may find doors closed to her that she expected to be open. I have never expected doors to be open to me, Lady Constance. I have only ever expected to earn my place through my own merits." Rosalind set down her teacup with a precision that masked her trembling hands. "If society wishes to judge me for circumstances beyond my control, that is society's failing, not mine." How admirably philosophical. I find philosophy more useful than gossip. It tends to have a longer shelf life. Frederick laughed, a genuine sound of surprise and appreciation. "Oh, I like her, Sebastian. She has teeth." "Yes," Sebastian said quietly. "She does." The visit continued for another interminable hour, during which Lady Constance probed and prodded, and Rosalind deflected with a skill she had not known she possessed. By the time the guests finally departed, she was exhausted, drained by the effort of maintaining composure in the face of such relentless hostility. Sebastian found her in the library afterward, standing at the window, watching the black carriage disappear down the drive. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should not have let her speak to you that way." "You could not have stopped her without creating a scene, and a scene would have given her exactly what she wanted." Rosalind did not turn from the window. "She's trying to drive me away, to make me feel I don't belong here." "And? Is she succeeding?" Rosalind considered the question honestly. The visit had been humiliating. The reminders of the contract, of her purchased status, had cut deep, and Lady Constance's barely veiled threats about society's reception suggested a future full of whispered insults and closed doors. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the hurt, something else burned. Defiance. Stubbornness. A refusal to be chased away by a woman whose only power lay in her cruelty. "No," Rosalind said finally. "She is not succeeding." She turned from the window to find Sebastian watching her with an expression she had never seen before, soft and wondering, and full of something that made her heart stammer. "Magnificent," he said again, quietly, almost to himself. "Absolutely magnificent." The fourth week brought sunshine and tentative peace. Lady Constance did not return, though her presence lingered like a bad smell, her words echoing in Rosalind's mind at odd moments, reminding her that whatever understanding she and Sebastian had built was fragile, threatened by a world that did not wish them well. But within the walls of Thornfield Park, something was growing, something tender and dangerous and impossible to ignore. Sebastian touched her more often now, small touches, fleeting and proper, but charged with meaning. His hand at her elbow as they walked, his fingers brushing hers when he passed her a book, the press of his shoulder against hers when they sat side by side in the drawing room, reading in companionable silence. Each touch sent sparks through her nervous system, left her breathless and wanting in ways she had never experienced. She caught herself watching his hands as he turned pages, watching his mouth as he spoke, wondering what it would feel like to close the distance between them and discover the answers to questions she barely dared to ask. It was madness. They had known each other barely a month. The contract still hung over them, a constant reminder that whatever existed between them had been purchased rather than freely chosen. And yet she found herself unable to imagine returning to Bath, unable to picture her life without his dry humour, his unexpected kindness, the way he looked at her as though she were something precious and surprising. The walls she had built around her heart were crumbling, stone by stone, and she was not certain she wanted to stop them. "You're falling in love with him," Aunt Philippa said gently, finding Rosalind in the garden one afternoon, staring at nothing with a dreamy expression that must have been embarrassingly transparent. "I don't know what I'm falling into." "Liar." Philippa settled beside her on the bench. "You know exactly what it is. You're just afraid to name it." "What if I name it and it disappears? What if this is all—" Rosalind waved a hand, struggling to articulate fears that had no clear shape. "What if he changes his mind? What if once the trial period ends, he decides I'm not worth the complications? And what if he doesn't? What if he's falling just as hard as you are, and you're both too frightened to admit it? We've known each other a month, Aunt. A month is not enough time to build a life on. Your parents knew each other 3 weeks before your father proposed, and they were deliriously happy until the day your mother died." Philippa took her hand and squeezed it firmly. "Time is less important than truth, my dear. What matters is not how long you've known someone, but how deeply." Rosalind thought about the depths she had glimpsed in Sebastian, the grief, the loneliness, the desperate hunger for connection that he hid behind walls of ice. She thought about her own depths, her own fears, her own desperate hunger that she had denied for so long. They had recognized something in each other from the very beginning, something that went beyond circumstance or contract, something that felt, against all reason, like fate. "I'm terrified," she admitted quietly. "Good." Philippa smiled. "Fear means the stakes are high. It means you have something worth protecting." She rose from the bench and brushed off her skirts. "Now stop moping in the garden and go find your Duke. Life is too short for wasted opportunities." She found Sebastian in his study, bent over papers with an expression of concentrated focus. He looked up when she entered, and his face transformed, the severity melting into something warm and welcoming that made her breath catch. "Rosalind," he rose from his desk, "is everything well?" "Everything is well. I merely—" She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "I wanted to see you." Something shifted in his eyes. "Did you?" "Yes." She stepped further into the room, drawn by an impulse she did not fully understand. "I find I want to see you rather often these days. It's becoming quite inconvenient." Sebastian laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, that she had heard only a handful of times. "I know the feeling. I find myself manufacturing reasons to visit the library." "The library?" "Where you spend your mornings. I tell myself I need a particular book, or must check on a particular shelf, and somehow I always end up near wherever you happen to be reading." Rosalind felt her cheeks warm. "That's rather stalkerish, Your Grace." "Says the woman who just admitted she came to my study simply to see me." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the individual striations of grey in his eyes. "We are a matched pair of fools, it seems." "Perhaps." She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sebastian, Don't." His voice was rough. "Don't say anything yet. We still have 2 weeks, and I promised you a choice. A real choice, free of obligation. If you say something now, I'll never be certain it wasn't because you felt you had to. And if what I want to say is something I feel, not something I feel obligated to—" His breath caught. "Then say it in 2 weeks, when the trial is over and the contract can be voided, and you are truly free. If you still feel it, then—" He stopped, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed. "If you still feel it, then I will listen. I will listen to anything you wish to tell me." It was not the answer she wanted, but it was, she understood, the right one. He was trying to protect her, to ensure that whatever happened between them was genuine, untainted by obligation or fear. He was trying to be worthy of her trust. 2 weeks, she agreed quietly. "But you should know the waiting is very annoying." He smiled, and there was so much tenderness in his expression that she felt tears prick at her eyes. "For me as well. But some things are worth waiting for." The 5th week began with a letter. It arrived at breakfast, innocuous among the daily correspondence, addressed to Rosalind in a hand she did not recognize. She opened it without particular curiosity, expecting perhaps a note from a Bath acquaintance or a tradesman's communication forwarded from Aunt Philippa's house. Instead, she found a single page covered in elegant script that dripped with poison. "Miss Blackwell. You no doubt believe yourself clever, having secured the Duke's attention through whatever arts desperate women employ, but you should know that your position is far more precarious than you imagine. I have made inquiries. The circumstances of your father's death are not precisely as they have been represented. There are irregularities that the Duke might find very interesting indeed. Questions about where certain funds were directed and why. It would be unfortunate if these questions were to become public. For you, for your aunt, and for the Duke himself, who has already been made fool enough by one scheming woman. Consider carefully whether you wish to remain at Thornfield Park. Some marriages are not worth the price of obtaining them. A friend." Rosalind's hands trembled as she read the letter twice more. The words blurred before her eyes, but their meaning remained hideously clear. Someone was threatening her. Someone who knew about the contract, about her father's debts, about the precarious balance of her position. Lady Constance. It had to be Lady Constance, striking from a distance when direct confrontation had failed. But the letter implied more than simple malice. It implied knowledge of irregularities in her father's affairs that Rosalind herself did not possess. What had her father done? What secrets had he left behind, buried among the debts and contracts and desperate measures of a dying man? She should tell Sebastian. She knew she should. He had a right to know that enemies were circling, that his reputation was being used as a weapon against her. But another voice whispered caution. The letter spoke of making Sebastian a fool again, of reinforcing doubts he must surely still harbour about her character. If Lady Constance had somehow uncovered genuine evidence of wrongdoing, or manufactured convincing evidence, would Sebastian believe Rosalind's denials? He had believed Catherine's lies for years. He had trusted completely, and been betrayed completely. The wounds of that experience were still raw, still shaping his every interaction. If evidence appeared that suggested Rosalind was another schemer, another manipulator, she could not bear to see his face close against her, could not bear to watch the ice reform, thicker than before, freezing out everything they had begun to build. But neither could she hide the letter. Not from a man she was trying to love honestly. She was still staring at the page, paralyzed by indecision, when Sebastian entered the breakfast room. "Good morning." He stopped, taking in her pallid face and shaking hands. "What's wrong?" She could not seem to find words. Instead, she simply held out the letter, watching his expression as he read it. His face went through a series of transformations, confusion, then understanding, then a fury so profound it seemed to reshape his features entirely. When he looked up, his eyes were blazing. "Constance," he said flatly, "this is her work." "You believe me?" "Of course I believe you." He sounded almost offended by the question. "Did you imagine I would not? The letter implies it suggests my father was involved in something dishonest, that the circumstances of the debt were not— I don't care." Sebastian crossed to her side and took her hands in his, the letter crumpling between them. "I don't care what the letter suggests. I know you, Rosalind. I know your honesty, your integrity, your absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly who you are. Whatever Constance claims to have discovered, it is either lies or distortions designed to poison what we have built." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "How can you be so certain? After Catherine—" "You are not Catherine." His voice was fierce. "You are nothing like Catherine. She was all surface and performance, saying what I wanted to hear, being who I wanted her to be. You have challenged me from the first moment we met. You have demanded honesty and offered it in return. You have never once tried to be anything other than yourself." He raised her hands to his lips and kissed them. "I was blind with Catherine. With you, I see clearly. Sebastian, I know I asked you to wait. I know I said 2 weeks. But I need you to understand—" He stopped, struggling with words that did not come easily to him. "Whatever schemes Constance has set in motion, whatever poison she tries to pour between us, I will not let her succeed. You are the best thing that has happened to me in years, perhaps ever, and I will fight to keep you, if you will let me." Rosalind looked at him through tear-blurred eyes, this man who had been so frozen, so armoured, learning to feel again despite the terror of it. This man who believed her without hesitation, who trusted her instinctively, who was willing to fight for what they had barely begun to build. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will let you." He pulled her into his arms then, and she went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and breathing in the scent of him, sandalwood and clean linen, and something indefinably Sebastian. His heart hammered beneath her ear, as rapid as her own, and she felt rather than heard his shuddering breath. "I was so afraid," he murmured into her hair. "So afraid you would believe I doubted you, that you would pull away before I could explain. I was afraid you would believe the letter, that the old wounds would open, and you would see me as another Catherine, and everything would be ruined. Never." His arms tightened around her. "Never, Rosalind. I could not mistake you for her if I tried." They stood like that for a long moment. wrapped in each other, while the morning sunlight streamed through the windows and the abandoned breakfast grew cold on the sideboard. It was Marcus who finally interrupted them, bursting through the door with an expression of barely contained excitement that died when he saw their embrace. "Oh," he said, and then, with the particular tactlessness of brothers, "Finally. I was beginning to think you'd both die of unexpressed feeling before anything actually happened." "Marcus." Sebastian's voice carried equal parts exasperation and affection. "What do you want?" "There's a problem. Lady Constance has arrived again, with Frederick in tow, and this time she's brought company 3 of the biggest gossips in the county." Marcus's playful manner sobered. "She's up to something, Sebastian. Something public. I thought you should know before you face her." Sebastian's arms fell away from Rosalind, and she saw his expression harden into the cold mask she had almost forgotten. "Then we face her," he said quietly. "Together." The scene in the drawing room was worse than anything Rosalind had imagined. Lady Constance held court in the centre of the space, surrounded by 3 elderly ladies whose avid expressions suggested they scented scandal like hounds scenting blood. Frederick lounged nearby, watching the proceedings with barely concealed amusement. And spread across the table before them were documents that Rosalind recognized with a sick lurch of her stomach. Letters in her father's handwriting, financial records, the original betrothal contract. "Ah, there she is," Lady Constance said sweetly as Rosalind entered on Sebastian's arm. "The blushing bride-to-be. Do come in, Miss Blackwell. We were just discussing some fascinating discoveries about your father's business dealings." "Constance." Sebastian's voice could have frozen the Thames. "Whatever you are attempting, I advise you to stop immediately." "Attempting? I'm merely sharing information, Sebastian. Information that your betrothed should have shared with you herself if she had any honesty in her." Lady Constance lifted one of the papers with theatrical flourish. "Did you know, for instance, that Edmund Blackwell was not merely in debt, but was embezzling from his own clients? That the investments that ruined him were actually the discovery of his crimes, forcing him to make restitution before he could be prosecuted?" The room seemed to tilt. Rosalind heard a roaring in her ears, distant and terrible. "That's not possible," she heard herself say. "My father was the most honest man I ever knew." "Was he? Then how do you explain these?" Lady Constance spread the papers with a gesture of triumph. "Letters between your father and his banker, discussing the arrangement that would keep him out of prison. Records of payments made to wronged clients. And best of all," she held up a letter that Rosalind did not recognize. "A confession, written in his own hand, admitting everything." "Let me see that." Sebastian strode forward and snatched the letter before Lady Constance could react. His eyes moved rapidly across the page, and Rosalind watched his face for any sign of doubt, any flicker of the old suspicion returning. "This is a forgery," he said flatly. Lady Constance laughed. "A forgery? Sebastian, really? I obtained these documents from entirely legitimate sources. Your own family solicitors verified—" "I don't care who verified what." Sebastian's voice cracked like a whip. "I know Edmund Blackwell's handwriting. I have seen samples in the contract papers. And this—" he held up the supposed confession. "This is not his hand. It is close, but not close enough. Someone has manufactured evidence, and I have a very clear suspicion who." Frederick straightened from his lounging position. "Careful, cousin. Accusations of forgery are serious matters, as are attempts to destroy an innocent woman's reputation through manufactured evidence." Sebastian turned to face the assembled gossips, who were watching with the avid attention of spectators at a particularly entertaining play. "Ladies, I suggest you consider carefully before spreading whatever stories Lady Constance has been feeding you. The truth will emerge, and those who promoted lies will find themselves in uncomfortable positions." One of the elderly ladies, Mrs. Thornton, Rosalind thought dimly, had the grace to look uncertain. "Well, we did think it odd, Lady Constance suddenly producing all these documents." "Odd indeed, especially given that Lady Constance has made no secret of her desire to see Miss Blackwell removed from Thornfield Park." Sebastian moved to Rosalind's side and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I will be conducting a thorough investigation into the origins of these papers. In the meantime, I will thank you all to leave my home." The dismissal was absolute and utterly final. Even Lady Constance, for all her boldness, could not stand against the full force of ducal authority. But as she gathered her skirts to leave, she paused beside Rosalind. "You may have won this battle," she murmured, low enough that only Rosalind could hear. "But the war is far from over. He will never truly trust you. I've made sure of that." And she swept out, leaving poison in her wake. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Servants dispatched with messages, solicitors summoned, the machinery of wealth and power set in motion to counter Lady Constance's attack. Rosalind moved through it all in a daze, unable to shake the echo of those final words. "He will never truly trust you." Was it true? Sebastian had defended her magnificently, had rejected the evidence without hesitation. But doubts, once planted, had a way of growing in the dark. What if some part of him wondered? What if the seeds of suspicion had taken root too deep to be fully eradicated? She was standing at her window that evening, watching the sun set over the parkland, when Sebastian found her. "The investigation is underway," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "My solicitors are confident they can prove the documents were forged. There are inconsistencies in the paper, the ink, the dating. Constance was clever, but not clever enough." "I'm glad." Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Rosalind." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Look at me." She looked, and saw, to her amazement, not doubt or suspicion, but sorrow. Profound, aching sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry that you had to endure that she dragged your father's memory through the mud. Manufactured lies about a man you loved and respected. It was monstrous, and I should have found a way to prevent it. You couldn't have known. I should have known. I knew Constance was dangerous. I knew she would stop at nothing to destroy what we have built. I should have been better prepared." His jaw tightened. "This is my fault." "Sebastian, no." Rosalind reached up to touch his face, feeling the tension in his jaw beneath her fingertips. "None of this is your fault. Lady Constance made her own choices. The responsibility is hers, not yours. I brought you into this world, into my world, with all its dangers and cruelties. If you had never come to Thornfield Park, then I would never have known you." She cut him off firmly. "And I would rather know you, even with all the Lady Constances the world contains, than return to my safe, small life in Bath without ever having felt—" She stopped, aware that she was on the edge of saying too much. "Felt what?" Sebastian's voice was rough. "Tell me, Rosalind, please." She looked into his eyes, those grey eyes that had been so cold when they met, that had warmed by degrees until they blazed with something that looked like hope. "I love you," she said simply. "I know it's too soon, and I know you asked me to wait, and I know there are still 5 days left in this ridiculous trial. But I love you, Sebastian, not because of any contract, not because I have no other choice, simply because you are the most stubborn, honourable, unexpectedly tender man I have ever known, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." The sound he made was barely human, a rough, broken noise that might have been a sob or might have been a laugh. Then his mouth was on hers, and she stopped thinking entirely. The kiss was everything she had imagined, and nothing she had imagined. Tender and fierce, desperate and gentle. His hands cradled her face as though she was something precious, while his lips moved against hers with a hunger that stole her breath. When they finally broke apart, both trembling, his forehead rested against hers. "I love you," he said. "I think I have loved you since you threw my offer back in my face in your aunt's parlour. I tried to deny it. I tried to pretend it was merely attraction, or convenience, or the novelty of meeting a woman who refused to be impressed by my title. But it was love. It has been love from almost the beginning. Sebastian, I don't want to void the contract." His voice shook. "I don't want to wait 5 more days. I want to marry you now, today, before anything else can go wrong. I want to bind you to me in every way possible, so that nothing, not Constance, not Frederick, not any scheme or scandal can ever take you from me." "That sounds rather possessive, Your Grace." "It is." He kissed her again, briefly but intensely. "I have spent 7 years feeling nothing. Now I feel everything, and I find I have no interest in moderation." Rosalind laughed, though tears were streaming down her cheeks. "Then I suppose we must marry. It would be cruel to leave you in such an excessive state." "Cruel indeed." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as though he would never let go. "Say yes, please. Say you'll marry me." "Yes." The word came easily, naturally, as though she had been waiting her whole life to say it. "Yes, I'll marry you." Later, much later, they sat together in the library, hands intertwined, watching the fire burn low. The house was quiet around them, the drama of the day fading into exhausted peace. "We should discuss the investigation," Sebastian said reluctantly. "Make plans for countering whatever Constance does next." "Tomorrow." Rosalind leaned her head against his shoulder. "Tonight I want to think about nothing except this. Us. The impossible fact that we found each other. There is nothing impossible about it. You are the woman my father chose for me. Your father chose a stranger's daughter to pay off a debt. He had no idea what we would become." "Didn't he?" Sebastian's voice was thoughtful. "He knew Edmund Blackwell at Oxford. They were friends, you said, or something like it. Perhaps he saw something in your father that he wanted for me. Honesty, integrity, the courage to admit flaws rather than hide them." Rosalind considered this. Her father, desperate and dying, reaching out to the only person who might help. Sebastian's father, seeing an opportunity to give his cold son what he could not ask for himself. 2 men, making a transaction that was also, perhaps, a hope. "We'll never know for certain," she said finally, "but I like to think they would be pleased with how it turned out." "I know I am pleased." Sebastian pressed a kiss to her hair. "More pleased than I have words to express. Eloquence was never your strong suit." "No, but I am learning." He tilted her face up to his. "You are teaching me, Rosalind." "How to feel, how to trust, how to love without fear of betrayal. I did not think I could learn those lessons again. You have proven me wrong. I am happy to prove you wrong as often as necessary." He smiled that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face and kissed her once more. The fire crackled. The night deepened around them. And somewhere in the future, Lady Constance was plotting and scheming and preparing her next attack. But in this moment, in this room, there was only love, hard-won and precious and strong enough to weather any storm. Or so they believed. The storm broke 3 days later. Rosalind was dressing for dinner when Martha rushed in, her face white with distress. "Miss, you must come quickly. There are men constables there saying terrible things." Rosalind's blood ran cold. "Where is the Duke?" "In the entrance hall. But miss, they're saying you've stolen things. Jewellery. From Lady Constance herself. They found them in your room." But Rosalind was already running, her half-fastened dress forgotten, her heart pounding with dread. The scene in the entrance hall was chaos. 2 grim-faced constables stood by the door. Lady Constance, her expression triumphant, was pointing at a small wooden box that one of the constables held. And Sebastian stood frozen, his face a mask of horror as he stared at the glittering contents of the box. "There," Lady Constance was saying, "my grandmother's emeralds, stolen from my home 3 days ago and hidden in Miss Blackwell's chambers. The evidence is irrefutable." "This is madness." Sebastian's voice was strained. "Rosalind would never—" "The jewels were found under her mattress, Your Grace, by your own servants." One of the constables consulted his notes. "Miss Rosalind Blackwell, I am placing you under arrest for the theft of property belonging to Lady Constance Beckford." "No." Rosalind heard herself speak, heard her voice emerge calm and clear despite the terror clawing at her chest. "This is a lie. I have never seen those jewels before. They were planted—" "All thieves claim innocence." Lady Constance's smile was sweet poison. "But the evidence speaks for itself." Sebastian moved toward Rosalind, reaching for her hands, but the constables stepped between them. "I'm sorry, Your Grace, but we must take her. The magistrate will sort it out." "I'll come with you." Sebastian's voice brooked no argument. "I'll post bail." Sebastian." Rosalind caught his eyes, holding his gaze with all the love and trust she possessed. "It's all right. This is a lie, and lies can be proven false. Find the proof. I'll be fine." But as the constables led her away, as she watched Sebastian's anguished face recede in the doorway, she saw Lady Constance move to his side, saw her place a comforting hand on his arm, saw her lean close to whisper words Rosalind could not hear. And despite everything, despite Sebastian's declarations, despite his defense of her, despite his love, a cold certainty settled in her chest. This was the trap Lady Constance had been building all along, not just to remove Rosalind from Thornfield Park, but to destroy Sebastian's faith in her utterly, to plant evidence that even the most besotted man could not ignore, to make him doubt, just as he had doubted before, to make him see her as another Catherine. As the carriage carried her away toward the magistrate's office, Rosalind closed her eyes and prayed that love could survive this test, that trust could weather this storm. But in the darkness behind her eyelids, all she could see was Sebastian's face, and the faint, terrible shadow of doubt that had flickered in his eyes before the constables led her away. The magistrate's office was cold and cheerless, a cramped room that smelled of damp paper and old disappointment. Rosalind sat on a hard wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight despite the exhaustion that pulled at every muscle. She had been here for hours, questioned, documented, treated with the particular mixture of contempt and curiosity reserved for gentlewomen accused of common crimes. The irony was not lost on her. She had arrived at Thornfield Park as a woman purchased by contract, her autonomy stripped away by men's signatures on paper. Now she sat accused of theft, her freedom once again determined by forces beyond her control. But this time, the stakes were different. This time, she had something worth fighting for. The door opened, and she looked up expecting another constable, another round of questions she had already answered a dozen times. Instead, she found Marcus, his usually cheerful face drawn with worry. "Rosalind." He crossed to her quickly, taking the chair beside her. "Are you all right? Have they treated you well?" "Well enough, given the circumstances." She managed a small smile. "Where is Sebastian?" Marcus hesitated, and something cold settled in her stomach. "He's coming. He had to. There were matters to arrange, evidence to gather." But Marcus would not meet her eyes, and Rosalind felt the cold spread deeper. "Marcus, Tell me." "It's nothing. He's just—" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his brother that it made her chest ache. "Constance spoke to him after you were taken. She had more documents, letters, supposedly from your father, suggesting you knew about the embezzlement all along, that you came to Thornfield Park specifically to secure your position before the truth emerged." "And he believed her?" No, of course not. But the words came too quickly, too forcefully. "He's investigating. He sent men to London to verify the document's authenticity. He's been working through the night. But he's not here." The silence that followed was answer enough. Rosalind closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it settle over her like a physical thing. She had known this was possible. Had known, from the moment she saw that flicker of doubt in Sebastian's face, that Lady Constance's poison might prove stronger than love. She had simply hoped foolishly, desperately, that she was wrong. "He'll come," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Once he's sorted through the evidence, once he's proven to his own satisfaction that I am not a liar and a thief." Rosalind opened her eyes. "That should not require proof, Marcus. That should require trust. You don't understand. After Catherine, I understand perfectly. I understand that Sebastian was hurt, deeply and terribly, by a woman who used his love against him. I understand that those wounds have shaped every interaction he has had since. But I also understand that love, real love, cannot survive on a foundation of constant verification." She rose from her chair, moving to the small window that looked out on nothing but a brick wall. "I told him I loved him. I showed him, in every way I knew how, that I was not Catherine. And at the first real test, he retreated to his doubts. He's scared, Rosalind. He's terrified of being wrong again. And I am terrified of spending my life proving myself to a man who cannot simply believe me." She pressed her palm against the cold glass. "I would have stood beside him through any trial. I would have fought any enemy, endured any scandal. But I cannot fight his own fear. I cannot make him trust me. That is something he must do himself." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, "What will you do?" "I don't know." The admission cost her more than she wanted to show. "I suppose it depends on whether these absurd charges can be disproven, and whether—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Whether Sebastian could find it in himself to choose love over fear, whether she could accept him if he did. The hours crawled past. Marcus stayed with her, a steady presence that she was more grateful for than she could express. He told her stories of his childhood, of Sebastian before the ice set in, of a laughing boy who had loved nothing more than riding wild across the parkland with his little brother clinging to his back. "He was happy once," Marcus said quietly, "before our mother died. Before our father taught him that feeling was weakness. He was the best brother anyone could ask for, warm and kind and fiercely protective. I've spent years trying to find that boy again, buried somewhere beneath all the frost." "You think he's still there?" "I know he is. You've seen glimpses of him yourself, haven't you? When he forgets to be the Duke and remembers to be Sebastian." She had. Those moments had been the foundation of everything she felt for him. The unexpected tenderness, the dry humor, the vulnerability he showed only when he thought no one was watching. She had fallen in love with the man beneath the mask, and she had believed, truly believed, that she could help him remove it permanently. Perhaps she had been naive. The door opened again, and this time it was a constable, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Blackwell, you're free to go." She stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "The charges have been dropped. Lady Constance Beckford has withdrawn her accusation." The constable consulted his papers. Apparently, new evidence has emerged suggesting the jewelry was misplaced rather than stolen. There will be no further investigation." Marcus let out a breath of relief. "Thank God. Sebastian must have—" "His Grace the Duke of Thornfield is waiting outside," the constable continued. "He asked me to tell you that the carriage is ready whenever you wish to leave." Rosalind stood slowly, her legs stiff from hours of sitting, her heart a complicated tangle of emotions she could not begin to sort. Relief, certainly relief that she would not face prison for a crime she did not commit. But beneath the relief, other feelings swirled. Anger, hurt, the bitter residue of disappointment. Sebastian had come, had somehow proven her innocence, forced Constance to withdraw her accusations. He had done what she asked, found the proof. But he had not trusted her. Not really. He had needed evidence to believe what his heart should have known without question. Was that enough? Could she build a life with a man who required proof of her honesty at every turn? She did not know. She only knew that she had to face him, had to look into his eyes and discover what remained between them after this latest storm. "Thank you," she told the constable, and walked out to meet her fate. Sebastian stood beside the carriage, his face haggard in the grey morning light. He looked as though he had not slept, dark circles under his eyes, his usually immaculate clothing rumpled, his jaw shadowed with stubble. When he saw her emerge from the magistrate's office, something broke in his expression. Rosalind. Her name was a prayer on his lips. He moved toward her, hands reaching out, then stopped, uncertain, hesitant, afraid. "Your Grace." She kept her voice even, though it cost her everything. "I understand I have you to thank for my release." "Don't." The word was rough with pain. "Don't call me that. Not now. What would you prefer I call you? The man who left me in a cell while he verified that I was not a criminal?" Sebastian flinched as though she had struck him. "I deserved that." "Yes, you did." Rosalind looked at him, really looked, taking in every line of exhaustion and anguish on his face. "What happened, Sebastian? What did she say to you that made you doubt?" "Nothing. Everything." He ran a hand through his dishevelled hair. "She had letters, documents, a witness who claimed to have seen you hide the jewelry, and I—" He stopped, struggling. "For one moment, one terrible moment, I wondered, not whether you were guilty, but whether I could be certain, whether my judgment could be trusted, after being so wrong before. And that moment was enough. No, no, it was not enough, that's what you must understand." Sebastian stepped closer, his eyes burning with desperate intensity. "The doubt lasted seconds. Seconds, Rosalind. And then I knew with absolute certainty that you were innocent, that Constance had manufactured everything, that if I could not trust my love for you, I could not trust anything at all." "Then why weren't you there? Why did I spend hours in that cell without you?" "Because I wanted to destroy her." His voice went cold. Hard, the voice of a duke who had wielded power all his life and was not afraid to use it. "I wanted to tear apart her lies so thoroughly that she could never threaten you again. I sent investigators to London. I tracked down the supposed witness and discovered Constance had paid him. I found the servant she bribed to plant the jewelry. I built a case so complete, so irrefutable, that she had no choice but to withdraw her accusations or face prosecution herself." Rosalind stared at him. "You did all that in one night?" "I would have done more. I would have burned down her house and salted the earth if it meant proving your innocence." He reached for her hands, and this time she let him take them. "But I should have been with you. I should have trusted you openly, publicly, instead of working in secret. I should have stood beside you in that cell and told the constables to go to hell." "Yes," she said quietly. "You should have. I know. and I am sorry, more sorry than I can express." His hands tightened on hers. "I have spent 7 years building walls against pain, against trust, against love itself. You have torn down those walls, Rosalind, but the foundations remain. When Constance attacked, when the evidence appeared, my first instinct was still to doubt not you, but myself, to wonder if I could be deceived again. And now? Now I know the truth." He raised her hands to his lips, pressing kisses against her knuckles with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "The truth is that you are nothing like Catherine. The truth is that my love for you is not blindness, but clarity, the clearest vision I have ever had. The truth is that I would rather be deceived 1,000 times than live without you." Tears were flowing down her cheeks now, though she made no move to wipe them away. "That is a very pretty speech." "It is not a speech. It is a vow." Sebastian released her hands and dropped to his knees on the cobblestones, heedless of the dirt, of the passers-by who stopped to stare, of anything except the woman before him. "Rosalind Blackwell, I have been a fool. I have let fear govern me when I should have been governed by love. I have failed you in the moment when you most needed my faith. But I am begging for another chance. Not because of any contract, not because of obligation or circumstance, simply because I love you, and I cannot imagine facing the rest of my life without you beside me. Sebastian, I will spend every day proving myself worthy of your trust. I will tear down every wall I ever built. I will stand beside you against any enemy, believe you against any evidence, choose you over my own doubts until the day I die." He looked up at her, his grey eyes bright with unshed tears. "Please, Rosalind, please give me another chance." She looked at him, this proud, wounded, impossible man, kneeling in the dirt before a magistrate's office, laying his heart bare for anyone to see. She thought of all the walls he had built, all the pain he had endured, all the courage it must have taken to risk his heart again after Catherine's betrayal. She thought of her own walls, her own fears, her own desperate need to protect herself from the vulnerability that love demanded. They were alike, she and Sebastian, both scarred, both guarded, both terrified of trusting and being hurt. But they were also alike in this. They had found each other despite every obstacle, had built something true and strong despite every reason to hold back, had chosen love even when love seemed too dangerous to risk. Could she turn away from that now? Could she walk away from the only man who had ever seen her fully and loved her anyway? "Get up," she said quietly. Sebastian's face crumpled. "Rosalind, get up, you ridiculous man." She reached down and grasped his hands, pulling him to his feet. "You cannot propose properly while kneeling in horse droppings." Hope flickered in his eyes. Then I accept. God help me, I accept." She reached up to cup his face in her hands. "But hear me clearly, Sebastian Ashworth. If you ever doubt me again, if you ever retreat behind your walls when I need you most, I will make you regret it for the rest of your very long life. I understand. I don't think you do. Not yet." She pulled his face down to hers. "But you will." And she kissed him, there on the street outside the magistrate's office, with constables and passers-by and probably half the town watching. Kissed him with all the love and fury and desperate hope that had been building inside her. Kissed him until they were both breathless, until the world fell away, and nothing remained but the two of them, and the promise of a future they would build together. When they finally broke apart, Sebastian was smiling that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "I love you," he said. "I know." She smiled back, though tears still streaked her cheeks. "Take me home, Sebastian. I believe we have a wedding to plan." They were married 3 weeks later, in the small chapel at Thornfield Park, with only family and the closest of friends in attendance. Rosalind wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by the village seamstress, and carried flowers from the garden that Sebastian's mother had planted. Sebastian wore an expression of such naked joy that more than one guest had to look away, overcome by the intensity of it. Aunt Philippa wept throughout the ceremony. Happy tears, she insisted, though she required 3 handkerchiefs and Marcus's supporting arm to make it through the vows. Mrs. Pemberton, watching from the back of the chapel, was heard to murmur that she had waited 30 years to see the young master smile like that. The contract, the original betrothal contract that had brought them together, was burned ceremonially the night before the wedding, its ashes scattered in the rose garden. Sebastian had wanted to destroy it immediately after Rosalind accepted his proposal, but she had asked him to wait. "It brought us together," she told him. "Whatever our fathers intended, whatever circumstances created it, that contract led me to you. It deserves a proper farewell." They stood together in the garden, watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames, and Sebastian took her hand in his. "I would have found you anyway," he said quietly. "Contract or no contract, I would have found you somehow." "You don't know that." "I do." He turned to face her, the firelight dancing in his grey eyes. "I believe there are some people who are meant to find each other, some loves that are written in the stars before either party is born. I believe you are that for me, Rosalind. My fate, my destiny, the person I was always meant to love." "That's very romantic for a man who claimed to have no heart. I claimed many things that were not true. You have taught me to be honest with others and with myself." He kissed her forehead gently. "I love you. I will love you forever. That is the truth I was afraid to speak, and now I cannot stop speaking it." The wedding itself was simple and perfect vows, exchanged in voices that trembled with emotion, rings placed on fingers with hands that shook slightly, a kiss that went on perhaps longer than was strictly proper for a church setting, but which no one had the heart to interrupt. Afterward, there was a wedding breakfast that lasted well into the afternoon, with champagne and laughter and stories that grew more outrageous as the hours passed. Marcus gave a toast that made Rosalind blush, and Sebastian threatened brotherly violence. Aunt Philippa gave a toast that made everyone cry. Even Frederick Ashworth sent his regards, though wisely chose not to attend in person. Lady Constance Beckford was conspicuously absent, having departed for the continent shortly after withdrawing her accusations against Rosalind. Rumour had it that Sebastian's thorough destruction of her schemes had included the exposure of several past indiscretions that made her continued presence in English society uncomfortable at best. She was not expected to return. "I almost feel sorry for her," Rosalind confessed to Sebastian late that night, as they stood together on the balcony of their chambers, watching the stars emerge. "You are a better person than I am. I feel nothing but satisfaction." "That's very petty, Your Grace." "I am aware. You have married a petty man." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Also a stubborn one, and a sometimes foolish one, and one who still struggles to express his feelings without formal preparation. You are doing quite well at the moment. I am motivated." He pressed a kiss to the curve of her neck. "I find that love is an excellent motivator." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the night deepen around them. In the distance, an owl called. Closer, Rosalind could hear the murmur of servants beginning to settle the household for sleep. The ordinary sounds of her home now, as much as Sebastian's. "Are you happy?" Sebastian asked quietly. "Unbearably so. It's rather alarming." "I know what you mean. I keep waiting for something to go wrong for the other shoe to drop, as they say." "Perhaps we should stop waiting." Rosalind turned in his arms to face him. "Perhaps we should simply accept that we are allowed to be happy, that we have earned this through all the pain and doubt and struggle. that we deserve joy as much as anyone else. That sounds remarkably healthy and well-adjusted. I'm trying something new." Sebastian laughed, that wonderful warm laugh she had worked so hard to earn, and kissed her soundly. "Then I shall try it too," he said against her lips. "Being happy, being trusting, being the man you deserve." "You already are," she told him. "You have been, since the moment you knelt in the dirt and asked for another chance." "Not my most dignified moment." "No, but perhaps your best one." She took his hand and led him back inside, toward the bed that awaited them, toward the life that stretched before them, full of possibility. "Come, husband, we have a great deal of happiness to attend to." 8 years later, on a summer afternoon that seemed painted in gold, Rosalind sat in the garden that had become her particular pride and watched her children play among the roses. Eleanor, at 7, had her father's grey eyes and her mother's auburn hair, along with a personality that combined the most stubborn elements of both her parents. She was currently engaged in a spirited argument with her younger brother about the proper way to catch frogs, a debate that showed no signs of resolution. James, 5 years old, and already showing signs of the serious disposition that marked all Ashworth men, maintained that frogs should be approached with stealth and patience. Eleanor insisted that speed and determination were the keys to success. Neither child showed any inclination to actually catch a frog. The argument itself seemed to be the point. "They're going to be at this for hours," Aunt Philippa observed from her chair beside Rosalind, her needlework forgotten in her lap. At 72, Philippa had mellowed into a comfortable permanence at Thornfield Park, beloved by the children who called her Great-Aunt Pippa, and by the staff who competed to spoil her. "Let them. It's good for their rhetorical development." "Is that what we're calling it?" Sebastian's voice came from behind them, warm with amusement. Rosalind turned to watch him approach, still struck after all these years by how much he had changed, how the ice had melted completely, leaving behind a man who smiled easily and laughed often, and had been known to engage in undignified frog-catching expeditions with his children. He bent to kiss her cheek, then settled into the chair beside her, reaching automatically for her hand. "Marcus is arriving tomorrow," he said, "with his new bride, apparently. He wants us to meet her before the formal introduction to society." "How romantic of him! How terrifying for her." "I thought we might be gentle, as a wedding gift." "Where's the fun in that?" But Rosalind was smiling, already planning ways to make Marcus's mysterious bride feel welcome. She remembered all too well how overwhelming it had been, stepping into the world of Thornfield Park for the first time. She would not let another woman face that alone. "Speaking of romantic gestures," Sebastian said, reaching into his coat pocket, "I have something for you." "Sebastian, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I want to." He withdrew a small velvet box and pressed it into her hands. "Open it." Inside, nestled against dark velvet, lay a ring, not the magnificent emerald he had given her on their wedding day, but something simpler. A gold band set with a single pearl, luminous and perfect. "It was my mother's," Sebastian said quietly. "My father gave it to her when Marcus was born to thank her," he said, "for making their family complete. I've been saving it, waiting for the right moment." Rosalind looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. "The right moment?" "The moment when I could finally believe I deserved this life, this family, this happiness." He took the ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger, beside her wedding band. "I believe it now, Rosalind. I believe it because of you." "Sebastian," her voice caught. Even after all these years, his capacity to move her remained undiminished. "You saved me." His voice was rough with emotion. "I was frozen solid when you came into my life, convinced I would never feel anything again, never trust again, never love again. You thawed me. You taught me that the walls I built to protect myself were actually prison walls, keeping out everything that made life worth living. You saved yourself. I merely provided incentive. You provided everything." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing the ring he had just placed there. "I love you, Rosalind. More than I did on our wedding day, and I thought that was impossible. More than I did yesterday, and I was certain I had reached the limit. Every day I love you more, and every day I am grateful that a scheming contract brought us together. I burned that contract. You burned the paper. The reality of it, the strange fate that connected us that remains." He smiled, that devastating smile that still made her heart stammer. "I would not have it any other way." In the garden, Eleanor had apparently won the frog debate, because James was now following her through the flower beds with an expression of reluctant admiration. Their laughter drifted back on the summer breeze, mixing with birdsong and the distant murmur of servants going about their duties. Rosalind looked at her husband, at her children, at the home she had built from the rubble of a forced engagement and a purchased future. She thought of the woman she had been 8 years ago, guarded, proud, terrified of vulnerability, and marvelled at how far she had travelled. "Do you remember," she said softly, "what I said to you, that first day in my aunt's parlour?" "I'm not your fiancé." Sebastian's eyes crinkled with amusement. "You were quite emphatic about it." "And what did you say?" "I believe my exact words were, 'You are now. The contract was already signed.'" He shook his head. "I was insufferably arrogant." "You were, but you were also right." Rosalind leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I was your fiancé, whether I wished it or not. And now I am your wife, because I wished it very much indeed. As did I, as I do, every day." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their children play, feeling the warmth of the summer sun and the deeper warmth of a love that had been tested and proven and emerged stronger than either of them had dared to hope. From the house, a servant appeared with a tea tray, followed by Mrs. Pemberton, who at 80 still insisted on overseeing all matters of domestic importance personally. Aunt Philippa began gathering her needlework, and Eleanor came running to report breathlessly that she had seen a frog, but it had escaped before she could demonstrate her superior catching technique. The ordinary chaos of family life, Rosalind thought. The beautiful, impossible, hard-won chaos that she would not trade for anything in the world. "Mamma!" James tugged at her sleeve. "Papa promised he would show me the library's secret passage today, the one behind the bookshelf." "Did he now?" Rosalind raised an eyebrow at her husband. "I wasn't aware the library had a secret passage." "It's not secret any more, apparently." Sebastian sighed with theatrical resignation. "I was sworn to secrecy by my father, and I have now betrayed that sacred trust to an audience of small children." "I'm not small," James protested. "I'm almost 6. "My profound apologies. An audience of almost 6-year-olds. Sebastian rose from his chair and swept his son up onto his shoulders. "Very well, young man. To the library. But your mother must come too. She has never seen the passage, and I suspect she will have opinions about its historical significance." "I always have opinions," Rosalind agreed, standing and brushing off her skirts. "It's one of my most charming qualities." "It is, actually." Sebastian reached for her hand with his free one, the other steadying James on his shoulders. "One of many. I could enumerate them, but we'd be here all day." "Flatterer. Truth-teller." He squeezed her fingers. "Come. Adventure awaits." They walked together toward the house, Sebastian with their son on his shoulders, Rosalind with Eleanor's hand in hers, Philippa following behind with Mrs. Pemberton, a procession of love and history and hope moving through the garden that Sebastian's mother had planted so many years ago. The roses were in full bloom, their scent heavy in the summer air. The old house rose before them, its stones warm with centuries of sun, its windows bright with reflected light. And somewhere in its depths, a secret passage waited to be discovered by a new generation of Ashworths. "I'm not your fiancée," Rosalind murmured, too quietly for anyone but Sebastian to hear. He smiled down at her, his grey eyes soft with love. "No," he agreed. "You're my wife, my partner, my heart." "That's much better." "I thought so too." He kissed her temple as they walked. "I thought so the moment you stopped being my contractual obligation and started being my choice. My choice, Rosalind. The best choice I ever made. And mine." She leaned into him briefly, this man who had been her adversary and her ally and finally her love. The very best choice of all. They crossed the threshold of Thornfield Park together, leaving the sunlit garden behind, stepping into the cool shadows of the home they had made. Behind them, the roses swayed in the breeze, and the echoes of children's laughter hung in the air like music. It was not the ending either of them had expected when a contract first bound them together. It was something better, something richer and more complex, and infinitely more precious. It was a beginning. And it was, at long last, entirely their own.